Hey everyone! Today we're going to learn the proper way to write a lab report. If you plan to take a college chem class, they're going to require you to write lab reports. It's also a nice skill to have if you plan to do anything in the laboratory in the future. So let's go ahead and get started. To begin with, let's talk about a few general tips. The first is refer to the lab report format. I have uploaded a document called Lab Report Format that shows you how you should lay out your lab and what does each part need to include. I'm going to show you this here as soon as I finish going through these general tips. The second tip is always label your units. Most people often get marked off because they're not including labels with their numbers. The third thing, make sure you're using complete sentences. This is like a mini paper, so we want to make sure they're complete sentences with a noun, a verb, and everything included. Lastly, make sure you're using the correct tense. This last tip is going to be a little bit confusing, so let me actually show you the lab report format first, and then we're going to come back to learning the correct tense. If you guys go to my website, under today's date, you're going to see it saying click here for lab report format. If you click there, it's going to bring up the general format or how you should lay out your lab report. The other link I have down here is a sample. So if you're confused and kind of want to reference something, I have provided a sample for you as well. So let's kind of go through these, and I'm going to refer back and forth between these two documents that I have up. The first is going to be the title page. The title page should include the following items. 1, a title, and it should describe what you're doing in lab. It should have your name, your lab partner's names, and the date that you did the lab. So here's an example of a title page right here. I just labeled it Scientific Method Lab with my name, my maiden name, Mrs. Chastain. My lab partner was James Grove, who was my husband, and then we did this on August 21st, 2018. The second thing to list is the objective. So your objective or objectives are what you are supposed to accomplish in the lab. What are you trying to do? What is your main goal? The objective should have some kind of verb, such as to measure, to analyze, to determine, to test. It should be a very concise statement of what you're doing. So in your lab, think about you're trying to determine something in your lab. If I scroll down, we always want to start your objective on a clean page. So here I have objective, and it's to perform the scientific method, to determine if everyday tasks take longer or happen faster without the use of thumbs. The next section that all lab reports have is usually an introduction. The introduction should contain any prior knowledge that is needed that experiment is based on, such as any principles, definitions, techniques, expected results. So you might have a hypothesis or theories and laws. A good example here is going to be looking at mine. I said talking about the scientific method. So if I'm doing this, I need to know prior knowledge on what is the scientific method. I describe it as the scientific method is an organized plan for gathering, organizing, and communicating information. It allows a person to solve a problem, answer a question, and understanding an event. And then I go on to describe it. First, it begins with an observation. Next, we form a hypothesis. Then I state what my hypothesis is. Then I say we have to create an experiment. Once it's completed, I kind of give a little brief overview. And then also with an experiment, we also need to know what variables are. So I define those as well. Here's where you guys can get a little tips on your first lab report. Think about what information would you have needed to know going in. First, this whole lab is about percent composition. So I would talk about what is percent composition. Second, what does it mean and how do you find it? Third, It asks you quite often in the lab to find the molar mass of something. I would define what molar mass is and how do you find molar mass. I would also kind of mention how in your lab you are doing a reaction between baking soda and vinegar and how that's a chemical reaction. Next, you should also mention percent air. What is it? And what does it mean if you get a high percent air versus a low percent air? Because it asks you guys to find that in your guys' lab. So these are some things that you guys can think of to add to your lab. And then any other prior information you think they should know, add that as well. The next on the list is the materials. So you're going to list any lab equipment or any chemicals that you used. So if you used a weigh boat or a scale, or if you used baking soda, maybe you used, let's say, tongs for something, or a graduated cylinder, beaker, scupula, all of those need to be listed. For example, in our example lab report, I listed all of them: stopwatch, book, pencil, paper, goggles, shoes. Next are your pre-lab questions. Not every single lab is going to have pre-lab questions, so you only have to include them if you have them. What you'll have to do is restate the question in your response and then make sure that they're numbered. So if I look at my example, here I put number 1, my question was such, and then here's my answer right after. This one, here's my question, there's my answer. The next one is your procedure. Now, your procedure explains step by step how you perform the lab, hence the word you. So if you did something different in the lab or out of order, this is where you're going to talk about it. Do not copy the lab's procedure exactly. Use your own words. When I brought up my PowerPoint, I said make sure it's in the correct tense. This is the part where we have to worry about tense. And I'm going to go through that example, but I'm going to kind of mention here. Procedures and your discussion and conclusion should always be written in an impersonal or third person past tense. You don't say the temperature, you don't have to say we are taking the temperature every 2 minutes. You don't say take the temperature every 2 minutes. You have to use sentences like the temperature was taken every 2 minutes. And I'm going to go through several of those examples. Also, note that the procedure is in paragraph form. It is not numbered. If we look back here on my procedure, 4 activities were chosen and completed by one person. First, the first name of the participant was written on a piece of paper with the use of thumbs. Second, and I kind of go through what happened in the lab. The next part is going to be data and results. This is going to be things that you filled out on your labs. This includes tables, graphs, diagrams, or observations that you have noted. You can include a diagram of anything that you use in lab. So for example, here I have put a table in that I was required to fill out in this lab. If you guys don't know how to make a table in Google Docs, please ask me. I can show you how to make one and get one made for you. The next one is post-lab questions. In this section, you're going to answer any post-lab questions that you guys had over the lab. Again, please make sure that you rewrite the questions. So here, you rewrote them, numbered them, and then make sure that you answer them. So here, number 6 pre-lab question, this was what it was asking, and here's my answer. Okay. And the last part is your discussion and conclusion. This is where your statement is going to refer back to your hypothesis or purpose. You want to state what you learned from the lab and if your hypothesis is correct. Does your conclusion back your data? What does your data mean? Also, this is where you can list possible sources of error. You can also say how you can improve upon the lab, and if you were going to do it again, what would you change? So an example here for my conclusion is the objective of this lab were met. I did go out and do what I said I was going to do. Using the scientific method, the experimental question, and I list the question, was tested. The results showed. So you're going to talk about what do the results show? That all the tasks took longer without thumbs. These results supported my original hypothesis. So do they support what you thought was going to happen? If they didn't, you can talk about possible sources of error. So here, possible sources of error that could affect the results were. Then we can talk about if this lab was repeated, what's an improvement you could make? What did we learn? So let's take a moment and think about your lab in general and give you a few little ideas what you should talk about. First, you should talk about your results. What did you guys get for the percent of carbon in sodium bicarbonate? What was that percent that you actually got? Then I would talk about, well, what percent should you have gotten, or your theoretical? Then I would mention, what was your percent error? If it was low, was it high? Talk about what it meant. If you had a high percent error, what does that mean? If you had a low percent error, what does that mean exactly? And then what are some possible errors? Everybody should have errors in their labs because we are all human and nobody is perfect. So you can talk about, well, maybe all your baking soda didn't get into your beaker. Maybe some of it dropped on the ground. Maybe you didn't measure something exactly like you should. Things could happen. Maybe you didn't let the reaction happen all the way and there were still bubbles in there trapping gas. That's where you're going to talk about it. Other considerations to take into account is please make sure this is in a Google Docs and 12 size font because that's perfect size. Label all parts of your lab report so I'm not confused which part's which. Label your lab questions and make sure they're all answered. And then set up your data section in a logical manner with your tables so I understand what's going on. Now, with that being said, I am going to go back and talk about the procedure, that tense again. Let's look at it a little bit more closely. I said that this lab had to be in passive tense in third person. All lab reports are written in passive tense, and the reason why is it's part of the scientific point of view. We observe and record as objectively as we possibly can. We don't want to add any personal bias in there, so we remove that personal bias or avoid it by removing ourselves from that lab report. It also helps clarify procedures and descriptions so they can be easily reproduced or redone. So what exactly is passive tense? In active sentences, the subject is first, followed by the verb, and then finally the object or the person or thing that the action happens to. An example of this is Zoe heated the beaker on high for several minutes. So Zoe would be the person, the subject, heated is the verb, and then beaker is the what was being done or that object was being used. Passive, though, this is where we're going to put the object first, then our verb, and finally the subject. So an example of passive sentences, which is what your lab report should be written in, is the beakers, that's saying, shouldn't be was, the beakers were heated for several minutes. The term were or was is a helping verb, and you're going to notice you use a lot of helping verbs in lab reports. So experiments demonstrate facts that do not depend on the observer. Therefore, the reports should avoid using first or second person. You shouldn't use the words I, we, my, our, us, my partner, Zoe, James, etc. It's understood that all actions are done by the experimental and their partner. Couple extra tips. Do not write lab reports as a direction, such as those given in your lab manual. So don't write heat the solution until it boils. Instead, you want to say the solution, which is the object, was heated to its boiling point. Notice again we have that helping verb and it's past tense. Couple other examples. You shouldn't say, I poured 200 milliliters of distilled water in a beaker because of the term I. That's an active voice. You also shouldn't say, pour 200 milliliters of water in a beaker because that's a direction or a command. The correct way to say that is 200 milliliters of water, water is my object, was poured into a 500 milliliter beaker. A couple other examples. We put the crucible on a ring stand. Again, that's active voice. We, that's incorrect. Or a direction or command is set the crucible on the ring stand. The correct way you should have said that is the covered crucible, so there's my object, was mounted on the ring stand. Here's another one. It says, I measured the temperature at 75 degrees Celsius. This is active voice. Measure and write down the temperature. This is a demand or a command. These are incorrect ways to write that. The correct way to do it is by saying the temperature was measured at 75, or the temperature was initially measuring, initially measured, because it needs to be past tense, at 75 with a thermometer. So here we have practice. The incorrect version is pour the mixture into beaker A. So if you want, try pausing this video and see if you can put it into the correct tense. Okay, let's see how we did. The correct way to state this is you could say the mixture, which is my object, was poured into beaker A. Notice again, we still have that helping verb. Okay. Another practice, the incorrect way of stating this is I stirred the mixture for 2 minutes. I want you to try pausing this and then unpausing it and see how you guys did. Here, hopefully you said the mixture was stirred for 2 minutes. Again, notice was is in there. Here's an incorrect version. James rinsed the test tube with the wash bottle. I want you to pause this and see if you guys can write the correct form of this sentence. Okay, let's see how you did. You could say the test tube was rinsed with the wash bottle. Okay. And that's kind of an overview of the lab report. I want you to get a head start on writing a lab report. You guys will have class time today to start it, and then you will have class time in the next class as well to continue to write it. So you will get a few class periods to get a hang of this and have me check over and ask questions. If there are any questions, please make sure you email me, and I hope you guys have a great day.